Hello, good evening, it's Dr. Alan Ngim. Tonight I'm going to be talking about melody. So, first thing is that I'm going to cover 5 different aspects of the melody. The focal point, the range, the steps and leaps, and the octave, which we've already heard about, and the contour. So, first of all, a melody is simply a sequence of pitches arranged to express a musical idea. So here we see a little melody, and you're going to hear this a little bit later as well. You might recognize this melody if you can read music, but I'll play it for you and see if you recognize the tune. That's just part of the phrase, as we call it. Notice that there's this red curved line over it. And what this line indicates is that these pitches, these notes, go together in an idea. And it's actually the first part of the lyric. We call that curved line a slur. And if we take the whole idea together, we would call it a phrase, just like a phrase that we speak. One of the most important elements of the melody is the focal point. Now, focal point is a term that we use in a lot of different ways. In photography, it could be where your eye is drawn to. Same thing in art. It's the main subject. In design, you always want to have a focal point, one main thing that stands out. In music, the focal point is the highest note in the melody. So when we're talking about melody, it's the highest pitch. In the last video, we saw that pitch as it goes up higher, you could see it in the music. So even if you don't know how to read music, I hope you could tell that this particular note, the dot, which indicates what the pitch is, that is lower than this one, which is up. And actually it turns out that these notes are an octave apart. So the one down here, if you follow the scale thing and you remember, that is actually C4, the note that everybody can sing. And this one up here is C5, an octave higher. So we all know, I hope, row, row, row your boat sounds like this. Okay, so the melody moves up to the focal point and then comes back down. When the focal point is in the middle of the melody, it kind of has this nice arch. I would call this kind of the average melody, and I'm going to be talking later in another video about this aspect of the contour, where the focal point lies. Here's a very familiar tune, Happy Birthday. I want to point out we have another term called the range. It's kind of interesting. I don't want to make a joke about this because it's a very bad joke, but this melody, if you know this melody, is called On Top of Old Smoky, and of course it's about a mountain range. And a lot of these terms, for some reason, seem to relate to this idea of a mountain. And I do like to think of the shape of a mountain as, we'll see later, related to the shape of the melody. So the range in this case is the lowest note to the highest note. And you could be speaking about a vocal range, for example, the lowest note you could sing to the highest note you could sing. You could be talking about a melody, the lowest note in the melody to the highest note in the melody. And since we're talking about melodies, that's how I'm going to use it right now. But it's the lowest note to the highest note. So if you look at Happy Birthday, again, same thing. We have an octave right in the middle of it, leaping up to the focal point. So that's a very dramatic leap. When you talk about melodies, a wide range would be anything bigger than an octave. I mean, an octave is about as big as you want the melody to be. Bigger than that, and people will have a difficult time singing it. So Happy Birthday starts out really easy. And then there's a bigger leap, and then this octave. This song has a pretty big range, like Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Even though they seem pretty easy, they actually are pretty challenging to sing. And if you sing in a group, you're going to notice that the group has a lot of differences in the pitch that they're singing. Most groups, when they're just singing this for fun, really don't stay on the melody too well. Now, a narrow range has a small range from the lowest to the highest. And, oh, I just noticed my picture's right over the music. Okay, so if you have a narrow range, maybe 5 notes or less, we're going to see a tune very soon that only has 5 notes in it. And that's a pretty narrow range. But there are melodies that have even narrower, 4 notes, or maybe even 1 note. There is 1 note melody that has only 1 note. Okay. You may have heard me say steps and leaps. So what is a step and what is a leap? Well, a step is just simply going from one note of the scale to the very next. So if you know how to play C major or a chromatic scale, we played them moving in steps. Or chromatic. Or maybe the whole tone. Those are all steps. If you skip notes in the scale, like this person jumping over steps, you do the same thing in music. You leave out notes, you skip over notes in the scale, like this. Right? So when you skip notes in the scale, you notice you get higher and lower much quicker, of course, and the range of whatever you're singing or playing will be wider automatically, probably because you are leaping up and down. Leaps tend to be, well, let me say that, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. Steps are really easy to sing. So if we sing do, re, mi, fa, sol, that's easy to sing. Just going up and down, going up the scale by steps. So when you have songs for children, folk tunes or elementary tunes, or things that everybody needs to sing together, they usually move by steps. Now, if you have a soloist, they get these really dramatic leaps sometimes. Leaps are, of course, much more difficult to sing. And as an example, the opening of the StarSpangled Banner is all leaps, and we'll see that in just a little bit. It makes the range really wide, and you have to have a lot of vocal technique to accomplish that. This singer, if you can tell, is singing with a rather unusual instrument that looks like a lute, and maybe she's singing a Renaissance vocal piece, a little bit more dramatic. Okay, let's talk about contour. Here we have, again, a mountain range. I like to think of music sometimes as depicting things in nature, or in this case, the contour of the melody is just the shape. And if you follow the contour of a mountain range, you know that it has its ups and downs, and usually there's one part that's the focal point, the highest peak in that range. So in this little bit here, you can see that if I were to play this as a melody, well, it would go up kind of gradually, and then you would get to the focal point and then drop down suddenly, and then have a gradual move down to where you started. And that's typical how melodies are. They can move in a variety of ways and shapes. Okay, so now let's put this together and see if I could describe it a little bit. Usually when we talk about contour, we might talk about the focal point, the steps and the leaps, the range. Here's Mary Had a Little Lamb. This is a children's nursery rhyme or song. So the range, of course, is very narrow. It's only 5 notes. Because this is in C major, you can play this actually on your keyboard just by following the steps. It only has 1 leap, and that's over here where it says little lamb. And you can see we're skipping over the space there. So when you begin, you start on the E, you go down, up, repeat, down a step, up a step, and then there's that little leap. There's a rest. Rest means you take a little break, there's a silence there. And then you do the same thing kind of again. Down a little bit, up to the same note, down a little bit, and then down to to do, the starting note of the scale. So I'll play it for you, and I'll kind of be the little bouncing ball. Leap. Okay, there's the focal point, and then so as I play these, you should kind of get the impression of how it affects you. How does it feel? You know, this one isn't super dramatic, but even so, when we get to the little lamb, it's a little bit of excitement right there, because it does go a little bit higher in the voice. All right, let's look at something slightly more involved, but not terribly. This only has a slightly wider range, so maybe without me telling you, you can just kind of scan through it and look for the focal point. So look for which note comes up the highest. And if you're good with this, you might notice that it's on the word let. Now, instead of being in the middle of the tune, this comes towards the end. When you have a tune that builds up to the focal point, there tends to be a lot more suspense in it. Now, this doesn't go super high, so it's not tons of suspense, but if you know the tune, you're kind of waiting for this note because you only hear it here. All right? The range, again, is narrow. It's only 6 notes. It's one more than Mary Had a Little Lamb. Whoops, doesn't go that low. Okay? And then the contour. Let's take a look at the contour. So in the beginning, it's just very gently up and down. Oh wait, I lied. There's another note. There's 7 notes. There's 2 bigger. So it does get there because it goes down here, and then it goes. But in the beginning, it's just there's almost only steps aside from this little tiny leap here down. And leaping down, of course, is easier in some ways. The second line, same thing. Barely moves. Only steps. And then in the last line, we get a little bit more motion, and then this motion up, which is this climb kind of adds a little bit more interest. And well, let me play it for you. You probably know this popular or this nationalistic little tune, My Country 'Tis of Thee. So it sounds like this. There's a leap down. There are a lot of other things to notice about this. We're going to talk about rhythm later, but there are some repeated ideas in rhythm. Right, this little dot. So you hear this top, long, short, long, 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 long. You hear that repeated? Also, we have some contours that are repeated. Repeated and then down, and that's repeated. Down 1 step. This idea of repetition with some contrast, sometimes repeating an idea lower or up, or some variation, very common because in music you want to be able to recognize things so that it keeps your interest, but at the same time you don't want it to repeat too much because then you'll be bored. So it can't be too random where you can't find your bearings, and it can't be too repetitious where you would get bored. And the really great composers have a nice balance between these 2 elements, as you can see here. All right, now I promised that I was going to show you the Star-Spangled Banner. Sadly for us, this is super hard to sing. So the national anthem, you can see in the beginning, and right away, it's only leaps from here to here. And the range is much wider than we had in, say, Mary Had a Little Lamb or the Star-Spangled Banner. So here it goes an octave and then 2 notes. But later, it goes even higher than that. Rocket's red glare, it goes up here. So it's an octave plus 5 notes. So it's like singing an octave, and then Mary had a little lamb on top of it. So in this one here, it's in the starting note of A flat. So, and then it goes 5 more notes. So if you had to sing this, if you're a soprano maybe, that's how wide your range would have to be, from this note here to this one. And for a guy, okay, so it's not pleasant, and there's always this little bit of suspense whether the person who's singing this is actually going to hit that top note. It's either that, or when they get to the very beginning, when they have to sing, they're down in the basement and they could, they could barely get out the bottom note maybe. So that's one of the challenges of singing the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, what's the good side of it? Well, it's super dramatic, and that top note only happens twice. One time, sort of in the middle here, on the rocket's red glare, and then at the very end, and the land of the free. So on the land of the free, it goes up very, very high just before the very last little bit. So that's a very, very energetic, very suspenseful type of melody. And for good or bad, that's what we have for now as the national anthem. Okay, I'm going to play 2 examples of classical pieces because I think I've reached the end of the video, but let me share for this just 2 little examples of what a simple contour sounds like in classical music and what something more complicated sounds like. So I'm going to begin with the last movement of Beethoven's Last Symphony, which many of you might know has the Ode to Joy, which is sung by a choir. Now, the melody itself, most people learn this in C major. And most of this is in steps. Anybody can sing this. It has very little rhythm. Almost all the notes are even. Oh, there's a little bit of rhythm. Okay, now there it does leap down. So the range is actually an octave, but it moves almost the entire time in steps with no rhythm. So you might think like, well, why would Beethoven choose this for his last symphony, this melody that's so simple? Well, this piece is supposed to be talking about the brotherhood of mankind. He was writing this, moving from the classical into the Romantic period. It was really aimed as an anthem for the people. So everybody should be able to sing this melody. And as you can hear, well, you can sing it, but in his treatment of it in the actual symphony, it's very sophisticated. He writes it with many moving parts. He harmonizes it in different ways. It's really quite amazing. And the symphony itself is much longer than any other symphony during that time. It was really viewed with kind of awe for a long time. Still is, really. People don't really quite sometimes know how to shape it exactly, or maybe there's some controversy over how to shape it. So I'm going to jump to the part where the choir sings this. It's more than 45 minutes into the actual symphony. For the first 3 sections of this piece, the choir doesn't sing at all, and so you only hear it in the last 15 or so minutes, and this is actually 6 minutes into the last section of the symphony. And what you're going to hear right in the very beginning of it are some octaves in the orchestra, almost like a mountain. It's hard to explain exactly, but you'll hear the orchestra leaping up and down octaves. Then it'll be very, very quiet for a minute, and then the choir bursts forth with this amazing chorale. So let's take a listen. Okay, so those were the octaves.
Right.
lot more complicated. But what you should notice is that is the really straightforward melody in that wonderful opening for the choir, really. And I highly recommend you go and listen to this last section of Beethoven's last symphony, the Ninth Symphony. Okay, very simple melody. Now let's take a look at something very complicated. We'll take a look at Bach. And as you know now with our overview of styles, the Baroque style is very complicated. So we're going to hear a solo for violin, and this is the Bach Partita No. 3. And in the beginning, the melody is kind of simple. You'll hear it's really difficult, the violin jumping up and down, but the lower part is the melody. And then a little bit later into it, before I stop it, you'll hear a very, very complicated melody where all of the notes are the melody, and it's quite convoluted. This goes on for a while, but we don't have time to hear the whole thing. So let's take a listen to this. This is the opening, the preludium for the Violin Partita No. 3 by Bach. Okay, it's kind of hard to stop this, but what a better way, there's no better way actually, to end this. I invite you to go and listen to that whole first section. It's not very long, it's only less than, well, a little bit more than 3 minutes. So it's really great, and of course there's many partitas by Bach for violin solo, and then there's also cello suites. There's a whole group of solo pieces for string instruments. So if you like that, there's a wealth out there for you to discover. I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you soon.